The village of Bratianu had stood in that valley for 400 years without incident. In the winter of 1887, something arrived that the oldest residents said they had no name for, though they recognized it the moment they saw it move. By the following spring, 11 families had abandoned their homes, 3 men had disappeared into the forest, and a traveling priest had filled 2 notebooks with testimonies he spent the rest of his life trying to explain. My name is Father Emilian Draghici. I was 31 years old in the autumn of 1887 when my bishop assigned me to a circuit through the Carpathian foothills, a region of scattered parishes that saw a resident priest perhaps once every 2 or 3 years. The villages along that circuit were old places, of the kind that had grown up around the land rather than being planned or built in any deliberate way. They followed the contours of the valleys, pressed against the lower slopes of the mountains, surrounded on 3 sides by forests so dense that the tree line looked from a distance like a wall someone had constructed to keep the world in 2 separate halves. The valley floor was good for grazing. The slopes above were not good for much of anything except timber, and the timber had largely been left alone because the slopes were steep and the winters came early and hard. I had traveled the circuit once before, 2 years prior, in the autumn of 1885. I knew the general character of the region. I knew the roads, such as they were, and I knew that the people there were private and religious and deeply attached to a form of faith that blended the teachings of the church with older practices their grandmothers had taught them, and their grandmothers had taught before that. I did not judge this. I'd grown up in a village myself, in the foothills west of Sibiu, and I understood that people who live close to difficult land develop a close relationship with whatever they believe inhabits it. I traveled with a single horse, a cart, and a young assistant named Petru, who was 17 years old and had never been more than 30 kilometers from the town where he was born. We arrived in the first village on the circuit, a place called Sarishore, in the middle of October. The harvest had been completed, and the first cold had already settled into the valley. And there was nothing unusual about Sarishore. The people were cordial, the church was in reasonable repair, and the priest who had last visited before me had left notes suggesting the congregation was healthy in its attendance and modest in its difficulties. We stayed 2 nights, completed the sacraments that had accumulated in our absence, and continued south along the valley road toward the next settlement, a place called Poana Negra, which sat perhaps 18 kilometers deeper into the foothills. I should tell you about the road between Sarishore and Poana Negra, because it matters to understanding everything that came after. The road followed the valley floor for the first several kilometers, then climbed a low ridge before descending again into a second, narrower valley. The ridge itself was not particularly steep, but the forest on either side of the road thickened considerably once you left the Sarishore Valley, and by the time you reached the top of the ridge and began the descent, you were enclosed on both sides by old-growth spruce and fir that reduced the light even at midday to something dim and greenish. In summer, I imagine it was merely beautiful. In mid-October, with the leaves of the few deciduous trees already stripped and the conifers pressing close to the road on both sides, it was something else. It was the kind of place that made you feel watched without being able to explain why. Petru noticed it first. He said nothing specific, only that he kept feeling as though something was pacing us through the trees. And I told him that deer and fox were common in that forest, and that any number of animals might be moving parallel to us without any sinister purpose. He accepted this and did not raise the subject again, but I noticed that he sat with his back straighter than usual for the remainder of the descent, and that he did not speak until we had cleared the tree line and the Poana Negra Valley opened up below us. Poana Negra was a village of perhaps 90 souls spread across 23 households. It sat on a relatively flat section of the valley floor, bordered to the east by a small river and to the west by the rising slopes of the main Carpathian ridge. The forest began perhaps 200 meters behind the westernmost houses. This distance, I would come to understand, and was not considered sufficient by anyone who had lived there for more than a generation. The headman of the village was a farmer named Constantin Morariu, a broad, quiet man in his late 50s who had lived in Poana Negra his entire life and whose family had been in the valley for at least 4 generations that he could count. He met us at the edge of the village with a reserve that I initially attributed to the general temperament of the region. I had learned in my previous circuit that people in these valleys did not extend warmth immediately to outsiders, even to priests. It was not unfriendliness so much as a kind of careful assessment. They watched you before they decided what to give you. Morariu showed us to the house that had been prepared for our stay, and a solid stone structure near the center of the village that served as a kind of communal guest house. He arranged for our horse to be stabled and for food to be brought that evening. He was polite throughout, but as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway and said something that I wrote down that evening almost word for word, because something in the way he said it stayed with me. He said, "The animals have been strange this season. I would advise you not to walk toward the forest after dark, Father. Not until we understand what is moving there." I asked him what he meant. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at me, and said that livestock had been dying. He said the wounds were not consistent with wolf kills, though the tracks around the dead animals had initially suggested wolves. He said the tracks changed, and he said that several of the older villagers had begun to speak of something they had not discussed in many years. He did not elaborate on what that something was. He said good night and left. I confess that I did not give his words the weight they deserved that first evening. I was a young priest, educated in Sibiu, trained to attribute the fears of rural communities to superstition, isolation, and the natural anxieties of people who lived close to wilderness. I had heard stories of wolves behaving oddly, of bears coming down from the high slopes in lean years, of unusual weather patterns affecting the behavior of local fauna. I wrote in my notes that evening, livestock losses reported, unusual track patterns, possible large predator from upper slopes. I wrote, check with Morariu on numbers and dates. I said my evening prayers and slept. The following morning I rose early and walked through the village before the households were fully awake. It was a habit I had developed on circuit. Early morning was the best time to see a place honestly, before people had composed themselves for an outsider's company. I could count the condition of the gardens, assess the state of the rooftops, observe who rose first and who rose last. I could see what a village looked like when it was simply itself. What I noticed that morning was this. Every household I could observe had its shutters closed and latched, despite the fact that the morning was clear and cold and bright. This was unusual. October mornings in the Carpathians are often the best light of the year, and it was common practice to open shutters early to let the autumn sun do as much warming work as possible before midday. See, the shutters being closed was not, in itself, alarming. But the latches were on the inside, and on 3 houses I passed, I could see that additional wooden bars had been placed across the shutters from within, visible through the gaps where the shutters did not quite meet at the center. Someone in Poana Negra was reinforcing their windows. I also noticed the dogs. Village dogs in the Carpathians at that time were working animals, large and territorial, and not given to unusual behavior. They lived their lives in a relatively narrow emotional range, alert, calm, working, or sleeping. The dogs in Poana Negra that morning were none of those things. They were gathered, each of them tight against the walls of their respective houses or outbuildings, or not chained but pressed into corners or against foundations as though they were trying to reduce the amount of themselves visible from any direction. They were silent. Dogs in that region were never entirely silent in the morning. There was always some exchange, some assertion of territory, some response to a neighbor dog's movement. That morning there was nothing. They watched me as I walked past. Their eyes did not leave me. I want to be precise about this because I have been asked many times over the years whether I was inclined toward exaggeration or toward a temperament that found meaning in ambiguous signs. The answer is no. I was trained to observe systematically. I recorded what I saw. I did not at that moment interpret the closed shutters and the strange dogs as supernatural evidence of anything. I noted them. They unsettled me. And I noted that too. Something in the village had changed the behavior of both the people and the animals. The question was what? I found Constantin Morariu in his yard, splitting firewood in the early light. He nodded at me and kept working for a moment before setting down his axe. I asked him to tell me more specifically what had been happening with the livestock. He looked at me for a long moment, then called into his house. A moment later, his wife appeared in the doorway. She was a small, dark-haired woman of perhaps 50, with a particular stillness about her face that people develop when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time. Her name was Ileana. Morariu said, "Tell the father what you saw last Thursday." Ileana Morariu was quiet for a moment. Then she folded her hands in front of her and described, and without embellishment, the following. She had been awake before dawn, unable to sleep, sitting near the front window of their house. The window was shuttered but not fully latched, and she had opened it slightly to feel the cold air, which she said sometimes helped her when she could not rest. From that position, with the shutter open perhaps 15 centimeters, she had seen something moving at the far edge of the village, near the path that led toward the western forest. She described it first as a figure, a tall, thin shape moving along the field boundary. She said it moved wrongly. She used the Romanian word neregulat, which translates roughly as irregular or inconsistent, and she said it again. Neregulat, but not like a sick person, like something that had not quite decided what shape to use. She watched it for what she estimated was 2 minutes. Then it went to its knees in the field. And then, she said, she could not see it anymore, but she could hear it, a low sound, not a howl, but something beneath a howl, as though the howling were happening inside the ground itself, rather than in the air above it. I wrote all of this down. I asked her, could it have been a person? She said no. I asked if it could have been an animal, a bear perhaps, standing upright as bears sometimes do. She looked at me with an expression I've never forgotten, a kind of patient exhaustion, as though I were a well-meaning child who had said something very stupid. She said, "I've lived here 51 years. I know what a bear looks like standing up. I know what everything in this valley looks like standing up. I do not know what that was standing up." Over the course of that morning and into the afternoon, I spoke with 7 more households. I want to give you a sense of what I collected, not to convince you of a particular interpretation, but because the consistency across the testimonies was itself a significant fact, one that I spent many years afterward attempting to explain through ordinary means before I stopped trying. The first consistent element was the shape of the tracks. 4 separate witnesses, including Morariu himself, described finding tracks around the carcasses of dead livestock that did not hold consistent form over the length of a trail. What began as large, deep tracks, suggestive of a heavy quadruped, would shift midway along the trail into something elongated with a different stride length and a different impression depth, and then shift again, sometimes ending in what appeared to be human-shaped footprints at the edge of the field or the beginning of the forest. One witness, a shepherd named Vasile Popa, who had been tracking animals in those hills his entire life, said that in 40 years he had never seen a trail that changed the way those trails changed. He said it was not degradation from weather or distortion from the ground. He said the tracks themselves were different shapes, as though multiple different creatures had walked in precise single file along the exact same path. The second consistent element was the voices. This detail I received from 5 different witnesses independently, without any of them being present when another gave their account. Each described hearing at night, usually in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, at a voice from outside their home, always from just outside, not from the road or the field, but from directly beneath a window or directly outside a door. The voices, in each account, were familiar. They belonged to people the witness knew. A woman described hearing her dead mother's voice asking to be let in. A man described hearing his son's voice, though his son was alive and sleeping in the next room. An elderly couple described hearing each other's voices simultaneously, each calling to the other from outside, while they were both inside sitting at their table. In every case, the witness did not open the door or the shutter. In every case, the voice continued for some minutes and then stopped. In 2 cases, after the voice stopped, the witness heard the slow sound of something moving away through the frozen grass. I want to stop here and address something because if you are a rational person reading this, and I hope you are, you will be asking yourself whether these testimonies represent a kind of collective anxiety, a shared folklore feeding into shared hallucination, a community that had frightened itself into hearing what it feared. I ask myself this too. I am not embarrassed to say that I spent the first several hours of my interviews actively working to find the seams in the accounts, the places where one person's story had leaked into another's, the places where the expected elements of a local legend were showing up in testimony without genuine independent origin. What I found instead was variation. Not the clean variation of invented stories where different tellers emphasize different dramatic elements, but the specific and irregular variation of real events described by different people from different positions. One woman heard the voice for perhaps 3 minutes. Another heard it for what she estimated to be nearly a quarter of an hour. One man's account placed the voice directly below his bedroom window. Another's placed it at the corner of his house, near the woodpile. The emotional quality of the voices, as each witness described them, was different. One said the voice sounded tired and sad. Another said it sounded perfectly normal, as though the person it belonged to was simply standing outside on an ordinary evening. Another said there was something behind the voice, a quality she could not name, that made her feel certain the voice had not been produced by a human throat. Real events are messy. Invented ones smooth out in the telling, and these accounts were messy in the right ways. On the second morning of my stay, the livestock deaths became immediate. I was in Mohariu's house completing some clerical paperwork when we heard shouting from the southern end of the village. Mohariu and I both went out. We found 3 men standing in the field behind the southernmost house, looking at what remained of a young ox. The animal belonged to a farmer named Dumitru Nitsa, a man of perhaps 45 who had the look of someone who had not slept properly in several nights. He was standing a short distance from the carcass, with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in a way that suggested he was working very hard to keep his expression controlled. I will not describe the carcass in unnecessary detail. What I will say is that the animal had been large and healthy and was now something that could not have been easily killed by any single predator I was familiar with. The nature of the injuries was not consistent with wolf or bear behavior. Wolves kill efficiently. Bears kill powerfully. What I was looking at suggested neither efficiency nor power so much as a kind of deliberate disassembly, methodical in a way that no animal I knew operated. There was very little blood on the surrounding ground, which is significant for a wound pattern of that kind. The cold had preserved everything since whatever time in the night the killing had occurred. And the tracks. I saw them for myself that morning for the first time. I crouched beside them and traced their outline with my finger without touching them, as they began at the field's eastern edge as deep, 4-toed impressions in the half-frozen soil that a man with experience might attribute to a large wolf, though somewhat wider in the heel than typical. They moved in a direct line toward the carcass. At approximately 4 meters from where the animal had died, the track pattern changed. The stride lengthened significantly. The impressions became shallower and longer, with a different distribution of weight, and the number of defined toe impressions reduced to something that suggested a different foot structure entirely. By the time the trail reached the carcass itself, and then moved away from it toward the western field boundary, I was looking at impressions that no combination of wolf and bear and deer and any other animal I could name would produce in sequence on a single trail. and they ended at the edge of the field, where the grass gave way to the leaf litter at the tree line. In the leaf litter, two clearly defined impressions were left before the trail vanished into the trees. They were human in shape, longer than a typical human foot by perhaps a third, but human. Vasily Popa, the shepherd, crouched beside me as I looked at these final impressions. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without particular drama, as though he were commenting on the weather, "It never leaves the forest the same way it entered." He stood up and walked back toward the village without another word. That evening, the men of the village gathered in the communal building near the church. I attended at Marariu's invitation. There were 11 men present. The discussion was conducted in low voices, even though they were inside, which told me something about the collective emotional state of those present. The question before them was what to do. The livestock losses had now reached 7 animals over a period of approximately 3 weeks. The cost in practical terms was significant for a community of that size. More concerning was the question of whether the thing responsible would eventually turn its attention from animals to people. This was not an abstract fear. 2 of the men present described incidents in which they believed they had seen the entity at close range, or at least closer range than the field boundary distances Ileana Marariu and others had described. The first was Dumitru Nitsa himself, who said that 3 nights before his ox was killed, he'd gone outside at approximately 2 in the morning because his dogs were making a sound he had not heard them make before, a kind of low, sustained whine rather than barking. He said he had taken a lamp and gone to his barn to check on the animals. He said that as he crossed the yard between his house and his barn, he had seen a shape standing at the far corner of his barn wall. He said it was tall, considerably taller than a man, and thin in a way that seemed wrong for its height. He said it did not move. He said he raised his lamp and the light reached perhaps 8 or 10 meters, and in that light he saw the shape standing completely still, and he saw its eyes. He did not describe the eyes as glowing. He described them as catching the lamplight in a different way than an animal's eyes catch lamplight. An animal's eyes, he said, to reflect light back at you in a point, a bright dot or smear of reflection. These eyes, he said, seemed to absorb the light and then return something darker than what they had taken in. He stood and looked at it. It stood and looked at him. He turned around and went back inside his house and did not come out again until morning. He said, "I knew that if I kept looking at it, it would have something to work with." I wrote that last sentence down and underlined it. I did not know what it meant at the time. I believe I understand it better now. The second man who had seen it at close range was a young farmer named Ioan Farxash, who was perhaps 24 and who had the defensive posture of someone who expected not to be believed. He described walking home from a neighboring house one evening at dusk, then moving along the path that crossed the northern field. He said something in the tree line to his left had caught his attention, a sound that he initially thought was a large bird landing in one of the upper branches. He turned and looked. He described seeing a figure in the trees approximately 40 meters from the path, visible between 2 large spruce trunks. He said it was standing on what appeared to be a branch or a forked trunk, perhaps 4 or 5 meters off the ground. He said it was looking down at him. He said it was shaped like a man, except that its arms were too long and it was holding itself against the tree trunk in a way that a man would find difficult or impossible. He said that when it realized he had seen it, it did not flee. It turned its head away from him slowly, and as though losing interest in something that had ceased to be worth its attention, and then it was gone. He did not see it descend. It was simply in the tree and then it was not. He said, "It moved like it knew I couldn't catch it. It wasn't afraid. It was deciding." The meeting that evening ended without a clear resolution. Some of the men wanted to organize a search party into the forest, to find whatever was responsible and drive it out or kill it. Others argued that to enter the forest in search of something like this was precisely what it wanted them to do. the oldest man present, a retired woodcutter named Gheorghe Strugariu, who was perhaps 75 years old and who had spoken no words at all for the first half of the meeting, said finally, "My grandfather described something like this. He said the people in the old times called it many things in many places, and that none of the names were its name because it had no name that a human mouth could say. He said the one thing his grandfather told him was that you do not go into the forest to find it. You wait. You keep your fires burning. You do not open your door to a voice. And you wait." The room was quiet after this. Then Moraru said they would wait 3 more days and see if the killing continued. If it did, they would discuss the search party again. I agreed to stay through this period rather than continuing my circuit. I sent Petru back to Sarishore with a letter for the deacon there, explaining my delay. I did not tell Petru what was happening in Poana, Negra. I told him I had pastoral business that required more time than expected, so he was a good boy and did not ask questions. That night I did not sleep. I had taken to keeping a small fire going in the hearth of the guest house, more for comfort than for warmth, and I sat beside it and wrote in my notebook for several hours. I tried to organize what I had heard into categories. Natural explanations. A large predator of an unknown or unusual type, combined with collective anxiety producing the voice experiences. This was the category I preferred. Folkloric explanations, the testimonies mapped with uncomfortable precision onto certain categories of being described in the older strata of Carpathian folk belief, things that were neither consistently animal nor consistently human, things that used familiar voices, things that changed form, things that were described as deliberate and observant rather than simply predatory. I did not prefer this category, but the precision of the mapping unsettled me. I thought about Dumitru Nitsa's phrase, "If I kept looking at it, it would have something to work with." I turned this over in my mind for a long time. What would it mean for a creature to have something to work with? What would it be working toward? On the 3rd morning of my stay, I was woken before dawn by a sound. I'm a light sleeper by nature, and the sound was distinct enough that I was fully awake within seconds. It was a voice outside the guest house window. The window faced the northern side of the building toward the path that led to the church. The voice was saying my name. Not Father Dragici, which would be the natural form of address for anyone in the village who wanted my attention. My given name. Emilian, spoken quietly but with a distinctive tone, the kind of tone you use with someone you know well, a tone of familiarity, almost of fondness. The voice was my mother's voice. My mother had died 4 years earlier in the village where I grew up, 160 kilometers to the west of where I was lying in the dark, with my heart striking hard against my ribs. I did not open the window. I lay completely still, and I listened. The voice said my name again, twice more, with the same quiet tone. Then there was silence. Then, after perhaps 2 full minutes of silence, a sound that I can only describe as movement through dry grass, rhythmic and receding, growing quieter, and then gone. I got up, I dressed, I added wood to the fire, and sat in front of it until light came through the gaps in the shutters. I did not pray, which I am ashamed to say. I sat, and I thought. By the time morning had fully established itself and I could hear the village beginning its day outside, I had arrived at a state of controlled composure that I maintained with some difficulty for the remainder of my time in Poana Negra. But I want to be honest about what those hours in front of the fire were like. They were among the most frightening of my life, not because of the sound itself, though the sound was deeply disturbing, because of what the sound implied about the thing producing it. Because to produce my mother's voice with that exact quality and that exact degree of familiarity required something that I did not have a natural framework to accommodate. I went to see Gheorghe Strugariu that morning. He was the oldest person in the village, and I had been thinking about what he said at the meeting. He received me in his kitchen with the slightly amused patience of a very old man who has become accustomed to younger people arriving at his door needing to talk. He poured tea. He asked me how I had slept. I told him what I had heard the previous night. He nodded and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked me, "Did you go to the window?" I said no. He said, "Good." I asked him to tell me everything he knew about what his grandfather had described. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the table surface, and I could see him deciding how much to give me. Finally, he looked up and said he would tell me what he remembered, but that I should understand that some of this came from a time before the church had much influence in these valleys, and that the old people understood the land differently than we do now. I told him I was listening without judgment. He seemed to accept this. He said his grandfather had told him that there was a category of being in the older world that did not have a fixed nature. He used the Romanian phrase fără natura statornică, which means roughly without settled nature. He said these beings were ancient, older than the villages, older than the roads, and that they had been here before people and would be hereafter. He said they were not evil in the way a cruel man is evil, because they did not operate by human moral categories. They operated by something else, a kind of hunger or a kind of interest, and the two things were not always distinguishable from each other. He said they had an ability, a fundamental ability, to read what a person carried inside them, their memories, their fears, their attachments, and to mirror these things back. Not because they wanted to comfort, because the mirror was a tool. When you see something familiar in an unfamiliar place, he said, the part of your mind that keeps you cautious goes quiet. That quiet is what it is looking for. I asked him if it could be killed. He was quiet for a long moment again. He said, "My grandfather said that people had tried. He said the ones who tried had to go into the forest to do it, and the forest was its place, not theirs. He said that on its own ground, it was simply something different than what anyone expected to find. He said 2 men from an older generation had gone into that forest to find something like this, and that only one had returned, and when the one who returned had not been right in his mind for the rest of his life, though he lived another 30 years. He said the man who came back refused to describe what he had seen. He would only say that in the forest it had not looked the same as it looked at the edge of the village. He said in the forest it was larger. I asked Strugariu whether he believed the search party the men were discussing was a mistake. He said he thought it was the particular kind of mistake that men make when they feel they have lost control of something, and they confuse taking action with regaining control. He said the older way was what he had said at the meeting. Wait, keep the fires. Do not respond to the voices. Do not open the door. He said it had come here for a reason he could not know. Perhaps it had been disturbed somewhere higher in the mountains. Perhaps it was a seasonal thing. Perhaps something else had changed. But eventually, he said, if you did not give it what it was looking for, it would move on. I asked what it was looking for. He picked up his cup of tea and looked into it for a moment. Then he said, I think it is looking for the moment when someone stops being careful. That is all it needs. The next 2 days were quiet, or at least quieter. No livestock were killed on the 3rd night. On the 4th night, a family in the eastern part of the village reported hearing the voice phenomenon again, a child's voice calling from outside their door in the middle of the night, calling for its parents, though all their children were asleep inside. They did not open the door. And in the morning they found the frost on the ground directly beneath their front window disturbed in a way that suggested something heavy had stood there for some time. The impression was not clearly foot-shaped. It was large, irregular, and deep. On the 5th day, 3 of the younger men announced they were going to do it. They were going to go into the forest. Their names were Vasile Popa's nephew Andrei, Dumitru Nitsa's older son Petre, and a man named Radu Ciobanu, who had come to Poana Negra from another village 2 years earlier to marry a local woman and who seemed to feel, perhaps because he had not grown up in the shadow of this forest, that the older residents were being excessively passive. Andre was 22. Petre was 26. Radu was 31. I tried to dissuade them. Morariu tried. Vasile Popa, who was Andrei's uncle and who understood the forest better than any of them, tried longest and hardest. He told Andrei directly that whatever was in those trees was not a bear or a wolf or anything he had encountered before, and that going in after it in a party of 3 was not bravery. It was stupidity dressed in the clothes of bravery. Andrei was young and had the particular quality of young men who mistake the absence of experience for a kind of advantage, as though not having seen enough to be frightened was somehow equivalent to having nothing to fear. They went in on the morning of the 6th day of my stay, which was the 23rd of October, 1887. I have the date written down. They carried rifles. Andrei had a shotgun as well. Now, they carried food for 2 days and said they would track whatever had been making those trails and either find it and confront it or at least gather enough information about it to allow a larger, better organized party to deal with it properly. They set off along the path at the western field boundary at approximately 8 in the morning in clear, cold light. They returned at 3 that afternoon. This is where the accounts diverge in ways that I've spent the better part of 40 years trying to reconcile, and I will simply tell you what each of the 3 men said when they came back, because I questioned each of them separately, and the differences are as significant as the similarities. They had entered the forest together and followed the track pattern I've described, the shifting trail that changed character over its length, into the trees for approximately 1 kilometer. At this point, they said, the trail ended. Not in the sense of being obscured by leaf litter or drifting snow. It simply ended, as though whatever had been making it had ceased to make contact with the ground. Andrei said it was as though the thing had lifted into the air. Petre said he believed the trail simply became too faint for them to follow on the leaf-covered ground. Radu said nothing about the trail ending. He said, when I questioned him separately, that the trail had not ended, that it had continued but the others had stopped being able to see it, and that this itself had frightened him considerably. The idea that the same trail looked different to the 3 of them standing side by side. They had then, by Andrei and Petre's account, Niu decided to split up briefly to search the surrounding area for any continuation of the sign. Radu's account contradicted this. He said they had not decided anything. He said that he had simply noticed, at a certain point, that the others were no longer beside him. He said the forest had gotten quiet in a way he had not noticed happening and that he had turned around, and Andrei and Petre were simply not where they had been. He said he could see for some distance between the trees in every direction and that neither of them was visible. He called for them. He heard, after a pause, something call back from the direction of the village. He said it sounded like Petre's voice, but the words were wrong. Something like, "We went ahead. Come on. There is something here to see." He said he did not follow the voice. But he said he turned around and walked directly back toward the village, following his own tracks in the leaf litter, without stopping and without looking back until he had cleared the tree line. Andrei and Petre's account had them separated for approximately 30 minutes before reuniting. Andrei said he had heard something moving in the trees approximately 100 meters to his right and had moved toward it. He said he never saw it clearly. He said he saw movement between the trees, something large, then nothing. He said the trees in that area had an unusual quality of light, as though the sun was coming through the canopy at a different angle than it should have been for that time of day. He said the air smelled wrong. He said it smelled like something burning, but cold. So he said he stood there for some minutes and then heard Petre calling his name and went toward the sound, and they found each other. Petre's account of those same 30 minutes was entirely different. He said he had not moved from the point where the trail ended. He said he had stood there waiting for Andrei to return. He said he heard nothing unusual. He said the forest was quiet in a normal way. He said the light was normal. He said he had been perhaps 30 meters from where he and Andrei had been standing when they separated, waiting, and that after some minutes, Andrei appeared from the direction of the village rather than from deeper in the forest, which meant that Andrei had walked almost a full circle around him without either of them being aware of the other's position. I sat with these 3 accounts for a long time that evening, and each man was sober. Each man was uninjured. Each man was, as far as I could determine, telling me what he genuinely remembered. And what they remembered was not the same event, not in the small ways that witnesses naturally differ, but in structural ways, ways that put them in different places, doing different things at the same time. The forest, it seemed, had shown each of them something different. None of them would say what they believed they had seen or experienced was impossible, but none of them would say they wanted to return to the forest either. Raduccio Banu was the quietest of the 3, and when I asked him as I left him whether he wanted to try again with a larger group, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a specific kind of tiredness, and the tiredness of someone who has just learned that a thing they assume to be simple is not simple at all. He said, "I do not think more men would help. I think more men would only mean more of that." He gestured vaguely toward the forest. That night, the creature came to the village. I want to describe this carefully because it is the part of my account that I am most cautious about. Not because I doubt what I experienced, but because it is the part I have revised in my memory most over the years, returning to it and reassessing it as I have gotten older, and my understanding of what was possible has changed, always carefully, always with a full accounting of what I actually saw against what I might have feared I was seeing. What follows is my honest reconstruction of the events of the night of the 23rd of October, 1887, a drawing on my notes written the following morning while the experience was still immediate. I was awake. This matters. I was not dreaming, and I had not been asleep. I had been writing by firelight for perhaps an hour and a half when I first heard the dogs. They made the same sound Dumitru Nitsa had described, not barking but a sustained, low sound, somewhere below a whine, something almost inward, as though the sound were being pressed out of them rather than produced. I heard it from 2 dogs, then from 3, then from what seemed like every dog in the village simultaneously. Then they stopped. Complete silence. I put down my pen and sat very still. The fire in the hearth was burning well and the room was warm. After a few seconds, I became aware of a sound outside, a slow, rhythmic sound at the edge of my hearing, like something walking on frost, but very deliberately, each footfall placed with care. It was moving past the eastern wall of the guest house, then around the corner, toward the front of the building. Then it stopped, and then something knocked on my door, not scratched, not pounded, knocked 3 times with a specific cadence, in the way a person knocks who expects to be heard. I did not move. I sat in my chair and I did not move, and I looked at the door. The door was a solid wooden door, well fitted in its frame. There was a bar across it on the inside. The fire was burning. The candle on the table was burning. The light in the room was sufficient that I could see clearly. Nothing tried the door. There was a long silence. Then the knocking came again, the same 3 knocks with the same cadence. Then silence again. Then a voice. It was not my mother's voice this time. It was a man's voice, an older voice, the voice of my bishop in Sibiu, a man I respected enormously, and who I associate with the deepest sense of safety and authority that I experienced in my professional life. The voice said, in a measured, entirely normal tone, "Emilian, I need to speak with you about the parish. There has been a difficulty. Please open the door. I want to tell you what happened in my body when I heard that. I want to tell you precisely because I think it is the most important part of understanding what this thing did and how it did it." The moment I heard that voice, something in my chest moved toward the door. Not my body. I did not stand up. I did not take a step. But something in me, some part that responds to authority and trust and the deep familiar register of a voice I had heard my whole professional life giving me guidance, that part moved toward the door. It was involuntary. It was immediate. It was the most purely automatic response I had experienced to any sound I had ever heard. If I had been a slightly different person, if my will had been slightly less prepared, if the night had been longer, or the fire lower, or the previous days less saturated with the specific testimony that had taught me what this thing used voices for, I think I might have stood up. I think I might have lifted the bar from the door. I did not. I sat in my chair and I spoke out loud, in a quiet voice, not to the thing outside, but to myself. I said, "It is not him." I said it twice. And then I prayed, quietly and steadily, not in any dramatic way, just the words of an evening prayer that I had said every night since I was a child, and I listened to my own voice filling the room. And gradually the pull that the voice had produced in me faded back to something I could hold still against. The voice outside spoke once more. It said my bishop's name, that is, it said the bishop's own name, as though the bishop were identifying himself to me, which was a thing my bishop had never done in his life because there was never any occasion for it. He was a man of certain authority, and he assumed you knew who he was. The voice said his name in a tone of slight puzzlement, as though surprised that I had not yet responded. Then silence. And then that sound again, movement on frost, slow and deliberate, moving away from the door, around the corner of the building, tugged away toward the western side of the village. I sat until morning. In the first grey light I went outside. The frost on the ground in front of the guest house door was disturbed exactly as it had been described in front of the Easton family's house 2 days earlier. A large, irregular depression deep in the frost. Beside it, partially resolved into something like a distinct impression, one outline that was large, narrow, and suggested a foot but not a human foot. Not quite. Something approximating a human foot the way a very skilled sculptor who had studied human anatomy entirely from description but never from direct observation might produce a human foot. Morariu found me crouching over it. He stood beside me and we both looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "It came to others last night as well, that we spent the morning making a record of where the impressions had been found. By midday, we had identified 5 separate locations around the village where the frost showed similar disturbances, all of them at doors or directly beneath windows. The pattern of the locations suggested something that had circled the entire village in a single pass, stopping at each structure long enough to leave a record of its presence. Not every structure, but most of them. 16 of the 23 households. The nature of the circuit was not random. Looking at the map I drew that morning, the locations formed a deliberate path around the village's perimeter, not following the road or the field boundaries, but cutting through the spaces between houses, moving through the village rather than around it. Whatever had made those impressions had moved through the inhabited space of Poana Negra the way a person moves through a familiar place, with knowledge of the layout and no particular hesitation. That afternoon, 2 households announced they were leaving, not just leaving their houses for a relative's home elsewhere in the village, leaving the valley entirely. One was the family of Nitsa, whose ox had been the most recent livestock kill and who had been living in a state of pronounced strain for the past several days. The other was a young couple who had married earlier that year and who had no deep roots in the village, having both come from families in other settlements. They packed their essential belongings and their children and they left in the early afternoon, heading north along the valley road. And 2 more households announced they would leave within the week if the situation did not change. Gheorghe Strugariu, when I visited him that afternoon, was unsurprised by any of this. He said something I have carried with me ever since. He said, "The thing about a creature like this is that it does not need to kill very many people. It does not need to kill any people. It only needs to make the village unable to remain a village. Once people start leaving, the village begins to die, and a dying village calls to it the way a wound calls to certain things." He paused and then said, "The older people understood that the best defense was not courage. It was coherence. If the community stays together and does not give the creature what it is working toward, eventually it loses interest. But if the community begins to come apart, and the creature can simply wait, I asked him how long it had taken in the old stories he had heard. He said it varied. He said in one account his grandfather had told him a village had held together for 3 weeks before whatever was moving around them moved on. In another account, the community had fragmented within a week and the village had not recovered its full population for a generation. He said the outcome depended almost entirely on whether the people trusted each other enough to hold their nerve through the period when the thing was most active. I found myself thinking about what it meant that the creature had used my bishop's voice rather than a family member's voice when it came to my door. It had used my mother's voice the first night, which suggested it had learned something about me from the first approach. Something about my emotional attachments, my deepest connections. And then it had refined this, changed its approach, tried something else. Something more precisely calibrated to my specific psychology, my relationship to authority, to institutional trust, to the voice that represented for me the deepest combination of safety and obligation. It had read me across 2 encounters and adjusted its method. There was nothing impulsive or indiscriminate about this. It was patient. It was strategic. And this, more than anything else about the experience, was what stayed with me in the years that followed. Not the form of the creature, which I never saw directly. Not the tracks, which were disturbing but ultimately just marks in the ground. What stayed with me was the intelligence of it, the quality of its attention. Like on the 7th and 8th days, nothing killed any livestock, but the voices continued each night. Several households reported sounds on their rooftops, heavy, slow movements above the ceiling, not scampering like a squirrel or a pine marten, but measured, weighty, deliberate. One family reported that a window shutter had been pressed from the outside with sufficient force to bow the wood inward, though it had not broken. The family had pressed against the inner wall as far from the window as possible and waited until morning. The impression in the shutter was distinct enough to photograph, had photography been available to them, though I drew a careful sketch of it in my notebook. The impression suggested something wide and flat had been pressed against the wood, tabar, with the marks of what might have been 4 very long fingers distributed across the surface of the shutter in a pattern that a human hand could not easily produce. On the 9th day, Andrei Popa, the youngest of the 3 men who had gone into the forest, disappeared. He had last been seen the previous evening at his uncle's house for the family meal. He had gone home to his own cottage, a small building at the northern edge of the village, at approximately 8 in the evening. His wife had gone to sleep. In the morning, he was not in the house. The door was not locked, merely closed. The windows were intact. There were no signs of struggle inside the house. His coat and boots were hanging on their hooks by the door, which in October, in the Carpathians, at temperatures close to freezing, was significant, as he had not left of his own accord in any ordinary sense. He had gone somewhere, or been taken somewhere, without his coat, without his boots, in the middle of the night, without waking his wife. I went to the cottage that morning with Morariu. We stood in the center of the single main room and looked at each other, and neither of us said what we were both thinking. I looked at the boots. I looked at the coat. Outside the window, in the frost, impressions. Large, irregular, deep. A search of the northern field and the tree line yielded nothing. Vasile Popa, Andrei's uncle, walked the edge of the forest for the entire length of the northern field boundary and found no sign of his nephew. The ground inside the tree line was too heavily covered with leaves to hold clear tracks, or at least too covered for anyone present to read them. When we found one partial impression approximately 15 meters into the trees in a patch of mud near a small seep. It was large. It was not human. It did not match any animal any of the men present could name with confidence. Vasile Popa stood in the trees beside that impression for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular. He went to the window. That was what he said. He went to the window. Andrei's wife, when I spoke with her that afternoon, said she had heard a voice in the night. Her husband's voice, she said, from outside the window. She said it had woken her. She said she had sat up in bed and the voice had said her name and had said, "Come look at this." She said she had started to get up. She said she did not know what had stopped her. She said she thought it was something about the way he said her name. A flatness in it, a quality she could not name except that it was not quite right. She said she lay back down and pulled the blanket over her face and waited, and eventually it stopped. In the morning, her husband was gone. The village was very quiet that day, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something heavy pressing on every sound that tries to rise. That evening, Morariu came to the guest house and sat across from me and said, plainly and without particular emotion, that he thought it was time to advise the people of Poana Negra to leave until something changed. He said he had spoken with Strugariu and that the old man had said something he had not said before, which was that in his grandfather's account of the older incident, the thing had not moved on when the village held together. So his grandfather had said it had moved on after something else drew it away, something from deeper in the mountains, an event or a presence or some other disturbance that he could not name. He said the village holding together had perhaps slowed the deterioration but had not ultimately caused the creature to leave. He said his grandfather had never been entirely certain what had driven it away in the end, only that one morning it was no longer present, in the same way that it had one day simply been present where it had not been before. I asked Morariu what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to hold on. He said this was his valley and his village and his family had been here for 4 generations, and he was not going to abandon it to something that moved in the dark. But he said he also understood that not everyone would stay, and that what had happened to Andre had changed the quality of the fear in the village from something manageable to something else, and that he would not ask people to remain against their judgment. He also said something that I think about often. He said, "The hard thing is that I cannot tell anymore whether I am staying because it is the right thing to do or because leaving feels like admitting something I do not want to admit." He sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I suppose that is the same problem it is always setting us." Over the following 3 days, 4 more households left. They went north, most of them to relatives in Sarishur or to the larger town beyond the ridge. They took what they could carry. They did not say they were leaving permanently. They said they were going until the situation resolved. Most of them, and as far as I was able to determine in later years, did not return. I remained for 2 more days after the primary exodus. The village at that point retained perhaps half its households. The livestock losses had stopped, which some took as a sign that whatever was responsible was also leaving. Strugariu noted with characteristic dryness that this interpretation had the logic of a man who stops bleeding and declares the knife has gone away. He remained. Morariu remained. A handful of older families remained, people whose entire lives were this valley and who had nowhere else to be and who perhaps, in the particular way of old people who have seen enough of life not to be entirely terrified by any single additional piece of it, had arrived at a kind of grim equanimity about the situation. On my last morning in Poana Negra, and I rose before dawn and sat outside in the cold and looked at the western tree line in the pre-dawn gray. I sat for perhaps an hour. The forest was still. The village behind me was still. Nothing moved at the tree line. Nothing sounded from inside the trees. The frost was undisturbed around me. But I was absolutely certain, in the way that does not draw on reason or evidence, but on some older and less articulate part of the human animal, that something in those trees was watching me sit there. I was certain in the way you are certain of a fact that you cannot prove and do not need to prove, because you have already organized your behavior entirely around its truth. I stood up. I looked at the tree line for another long moment. Then I went inside, packed my things, hitched my horse to the cart, said my farewells to Morariu and to Strugariu, who shook my hand in the doorway of his house with a grip that was remarkably strong for a man of his age, and drove north out of the valley. Andre Popa was never found. The official account of his disappearance, filed with the regional authorities sometime the following month by the village council, attributed it to an accident in the forest, a fall perhaps, or becoming lost and succumbing to the cold. There was no investigation of substance. A young man from a small mountain village in the Carpathians disappearing into the forest in October was not a circumstance that prompted the deployment of significant resources. It was simply a death of the kind that the mountains produced regularly, a life taken by the terrain and the cold to be noted and recorded and moved on from. I filed my own report with my bishop in Cebu, and I described what I had witnessed and collected. I described the tracks, the voices, the night the creature had circled the village, the testimony of the 3 men who had entered the forest. I described what I had heard at my own door. My bishop was a serious and thoughtful man, as I have indicated, and he took my account seriously in the sense that he took me seriously. He did not dismiss my testimony. He suggested gently that the events in Poana, Negra were best understood as a case of collective fear producing unusual perceptual phenomena, exacerbated by genuine livestock losses from an unknown predator. He said the voice phenomena were consistent with the documented psychology of anxious communities in isolated settings. And he said Andre Popa's disappearance was a tragedy, but that it most likely had a natural explanation that had gone unconfirmed due to the difficulty of searching that terrain. I did not argue with him. He was my bishop, and I was a young priest, and he was not entirely wrong that the account, assembled from the testimony of rural villagers and the perception of a single traveling cleric over 10 days, would not persuade the kind of mind that required formal evidence. But I noticed, and I noted in my private journal, that he gave me specific instructions about my continuation of the circuit. He told me to complete the remaining parishes to the south as quickly as was pastorally responsible and to return north before the heavy winter weather set in. He told me not to return to Poana Negra on this circuit. He told me to route around it. I did not ask him why, but I have thought about it many times in the years since. I completed the circuit. I returned to Cebu. I was assigned to a parish in the foothills west of the city, and I served there for the next 11 years. I did not return to the Carpathian circuit. I requested not to, which is an unusual thing for a priest of that seniority to do, and the request was granted without discussion, which is also unusual. I do not know what to make of that either. I returned to Poana Negra once, in 1903, 16 years after the events I have described. I went on my own without official purpose, in the summer, in full daylight. I wanted to see what the village had become. I also, I will admit, wanted to measure myself against the memory of what had happened there. To stand in that place in warm July light and feel whether the dread that had shaped those 10 days in October was something the place itself carried, or something that had been purely a function of the darkness and the cold and the particular sequence of events. I found a village about half the size it had been in 1887. Some of the abandoned houses had been taken over by families from other settlements. Some remained empty, in varying stages of decay. The western tree line was as I remembered it, 200 meters of open field, and then the dark wall of old-growth spruce pressing close. Morariu had died in 1896. His son worked the farm. Gheorghe Strugariu had died in 1899, which I calculated to mean he had lived to somewhere near 90. Vasile Popa was still alive and still shepherding, and a leathery and silent man of perhaps 55, who met me with the kind of greeting you extend to someone you recognize from a painful period of your life, respectful but at a controlled distance. I walked to the western field boundary in the afternoon. The grass was long and warm, and the light was good, and the trees were simply trees, green and dense and entirely ordinary looking. I stood at the edge of the field for some minutes. Nothing moved at the tree line. No birds were sitting in the branches immediately within sight, which I noticed but attributed to the fact that I was standing there and had perhaps disturbed whatever was roosting or resting in the nearest trees. The air smelled of grass and resin and late summer. It smelled like every mountain forest I had ever stood near. but I did not cross the field boundary. I thought about it. I stood there in the July warmth and thought about it quite deliberately and decided I would not. Not because I believed something was waiting there for me in the bright afternoon. Because I understood, in a way that I had not fully understood in 1887, that my understanding of what was or was not possible in that forest was not reliable. That whatever I had catalogued as knowable about the world, it did not include everything that the world contained. And there was no particular reason to test that understanding against the specific territory where it had first been challenged. I turned around and walked back toward the village. That evening, Vasile Popa and I sat outside his house in the fading light, and he said very little, as was his nature, and I said very little in return because there was nothing productive to add. And at one point he said, without looking at me, just directing his words out toward the valley, "Andre was a good boy. He said it the way you say something that you have said to yourself many times and that has never fully resolved into something you can hold at a comfortable distance." I said, "I'm sorry." He nodded. That was the last time I was in Poana, Negra. I'm 77 years old as I write this. I served as a parish priest for 34 years, and I've been retired now for 12. I've had what I consider a full life and a reasonably honest one, and I have tried throughout that life to apply careful thought to everything I encountered, including the things that resisted careful thought. I will tell you what I believe. I believe that in the Carpathian mountains, in the winter of 1887, something moved through a cluster of small villages that did not belong to any category I'd been taught to recognize. I believe it was old. I believe it was aware in some way that the word aware, as we normally use it, does not fully capture. I believe it studied the people it encountered and used what it learned in a way that was not random or instinctive but deliberate and adaptive. I believe it killed Andre Popa, or at least that it was the reason he was gone. I believe it remained in that valley long after I left, long after most of those who knew what had happened were dead, long after the village had partially reconstituted itself with new residents who had no particular reason to know what the field to the west of their homes had once meant. Whether it is still there, I cannot say. I am not in a position to go and check, was what I can say, and what I have said to the few people over the years to whom I have told any portion of this account is this: the mountains are older than us. The forests of the Carpathians were old when the first human settlements appeared in those valleys, and they will be old again long after the last settlement is empty. The things that inhabit old forests are not like the things we keep in our houses or find in our fields. They are not wild in the way a wolf is wild, something that operates according to instincts we can study and predict and account for. There is a category of presence in the older places of the world that operates according to something we do not have a science for, and perhaps cannot have a science for. Because the moment you bring the tools of science to it, the moment you attempt to observe and measure and classify, it is already doing the same to you. And it has been doing it for longer. The best advice Gheorghe Strugariu received from his grandfather was not about how to fight it. It was about how to not give it what it was looking for. It was about keeping the self coherent and the community intact and the fires burning, and not opening the door to a voice just because the voice belongs to someone you love. This is not dramatic advice. It does not make for a satisfying story of confrontation and victory. But it is, I believe, the only kind of advice that is actually useful when you are dealing with something that has been observing human behavior longer than any living person has been alive. Keep your fires burning. Do not open the door. And if something at the edge of a dark forest uses a voice you recognize, do not take a step toward it. Whatever it is not what it sounds like. It is never what it sounds like.